Dominic Cummings, one of the top media hate figures of the last few years, is out of the government. Even his enemies recognised him as an intellectual driving force that wanted to confront the elites, tear down bloated and ineffective bureaucracies, and put in place something that was more fit for purpose. What was it really about? And regardless of whether you love him or loathe him, is it actually good or bad that he's now out of the picture? Well, let's discuss. As I covered in a previous video, the media went full-on frenzy trying to bring down Dominic Cummings in the middle of the first pandemic lockdown. He was the man they most blamed for Brexit, and they hated Brexit, so they hated Dominic Cummings, and they thought they'd got him in their sights. They pushed out the message that his trip to Durham to isolate with COVID-19 was a really big deal. They pushed out the message, it's one rule for them and another for us. Unsurprisingly, that message, let's call it a campaign message because that's what it was, had powerful resonance with the British people, and having stoked that anger, they then demanded to know why he didn't resign in the face of it. Having focused their front pages on it for 5 days, they then argued that his action, not theirs by the way, was responsible for undermining the commitment of the British people towards lockdown. When he finally went this week, the journalist then asked, well, was it worth the Prime Minister standing by him in that instance, since it only bought him another few months? The answer to that is probably yes. Because it was surely worth establishing the principle that the mainstream media don't just get to pick people off in a way that they've become accustomed to. But that's a discussion for another day. In any case, there was at least some irony that Dominic Cummings may not entirely have appreciated, because that one rule for them and another for us message was actually pretty evocative of the sort of anti-elitist campaign messages that Cummings himself had pioneered. Let's do a quick recap for those that may not be familiar. Dominic Cummings first tried out his campaign approach back in the years of the Blair government. We'd seen devolution with the creation of the Scottish Parliament and the Welsh Assembly, and now the government wanted to create regional assemblies, and the North East was the first one selected with a referendum to approve the plan. Cummings went north to oppose it. The argument for the assemblies was about local democracy, but mostly people thought the assemblies would be talking shops without much actual power. Now that of course isn't winning language. Cummings' campaign message instead fed on anti-politician sentiment. Politicians talk, we pay. And it played to the dim view people had of politicians generally, with all the scandals there have regularly been about their bloated expense accounts, their high salaries, and what do they do anyway all day? They just talk, while the rest of us have to get on with real jobs. Now, obviously no political party would have taken that approach, but it fitted with the us the people versus them the elite approach that turned out to be the spirit of the coming age. In 2004, it turned out to be a highly successful message and the campaign was won. At the time, the BBC's Andrew Marr noted that many in the no camp were Eurosceptic campaigners. He said that ministers would need to reflect on the lessons for its referendum on the new European Constitution. Clearly they didn't, but Dominic Cummings definitely did. The next step was the campaign to keep Britain out of the euro. That introduced a key tactic that had been a feature of the Trump phenomenon in the US now, as well as the Johnson government since in the UK, the dodgy stat that captures the focus for debate in a way that plays to the campaign's objectives, works its magic despite the stat having been wrong. So for the campaign to stay out of the euro, they used figures like NHS budget £35 billion, cost of joining the euro £30 billion. Immediately you then had the campaign to join the euro arguing with the figures, saying that they're wrong, saying that the NHS budget was higher than that and the cost of joining the euro was less than that. But that put the media discussion onto the cost of joining the euro, exactly where the campaigners wanted it. It reinforced the general impression in people's minds that joining the euro was expensive. It wasn't the exact figure that was important. It was that genuine impression. By using deliberately incorrect facts, they more effectively communicated that than if they had been accurate, because nobody would much have talked about it if they'd given the right numbers. And that was the technique that worked so well again for them when it came to the Brexit campaign. This became one of the iconic images of the Brexit campaign, precisely because the Remainers argued the numbers so vigorously. All the media put the image on their front pages across the land, thinking that in so doing they were puncturing the credibility of the Leave campaign. But all they were really doing was making their case much more powerful. Cummings crafted the slogan, "Take back control." It was nationalist, but also fundamentally anti-elitist, and I saw it working with my own eyes. When I went to vote, there was a group leaving the polling booth as I arrived, laughing about how they'd stuck it to them being the globalist elites, although that's not the term they used. In running the Brexit campaign, Cummings dived deep into the data to get to understand how those people felt about the issues and how they saw the world. And he used us versus them logic to create an emotional response. He made sure the campaign spoke to people in the language that they would respond to, something that the elites running the Remain campaign were utterly incapable of doing. They'd run campaigns like this. Nothing to do with people's own lives, totally presuming that everyone has the same view of these people that they do. And of course, therefore, Dominic Cummings and the team won, as he did later with Johnson's election campaign, with a similarly powerful theme of "Get Brexit Done." All that would be interesting enough, showing that Dominic Cummings is a consummate campaigner. But that's just where it begins. If that was all there was to him, he wouldn't be anything like the powerful figure that he's been over the last year. Because what drove him through all of this was a fascination with questions about how government could be done radically better, how old structures were failing and should be torn down. During periods when he wasn't directly involved at the political centre, he explored a lot of these ideas in his blog. The media looked at his blog, and they just decided mostly it was too geeky and too odd for the likes of them to understand, so they just mostly mocked him for it and called him weird. Spitting Image played to this when it depicted him as an alien. No doubt all of that just fed his contempt for the lot of them, which was one of the mistakes he made, of course. I mean, by all means, feel contempt for the intellectual capacity of a tiger, but you should always hold on to the respect you have for things that might turn around and eat you. Not that the media did deserve some contempt, because he was asking some really important questions that they should have cared about. For instance, why are governments so bad at what they do? Here's an example of what he came up with. The main difficulty arises from the lack of suitable people in positions of power and the need for overturning existing power bases, which is always politically tricky. The most likely way it will happen is, as usual, by the exploitation of crises. Of course, there is also a feedback loop. The institutionalized dysfunction of the state makes it hard for any political force to make a significant change, and the more the priority of insiders is to remain insiders, to be, not to do, the harder it is to make changes. Well, he certainly got a crisis. It's not obvious whether it enabled changes or hampered them. By the way, that phrase, to be, not to do, is one that he repeats in a number of places. You could see the illustration of it in how people talk about Boris Johnson, a man who always wanted to be Prime Minister, but he didn't actually have a vision for what he would do once he was. Dominic Cummings had thought a lot about what you should do and how you should get things done. He said the workings of most governments looked like this. Real picture, by the way, showing the effect of multiple ad hoc solutions that create complexity and can't scale. He said the UK government system fails on 4 counts. 1, centralisation of power amongst people almost none of whose skills are up to scratch on even one element of IQ, willpower, management ability, and so on and so on. And this, of course, is true. In every career you'll go into, you'd be expected to have trained for certain skills that would enable you to do the job, unless you're an elected politician. Politicians that do well often do have some natural skills, but they're the ones that help you to get elected, not the ones that enable you to run a complex organisation. 2. Extremely powerful bureaucracy, incentivised to create rules rather than to solve problems. 3. The system, including political parties, is incentivised to focus on trivia, not to solve deep problems. And 4. A media that spreads confusion and an intelligentsia that has little understanding about effective action. In support of that last one, he says, look at top scientists' attempts to combat Donald Trump. Climate scientists and epidemiologists, pay attention. He said this is a failure of the system itself. Unlike markets and the scientific method, the political process has very few error-correcting features. Failed policies can be persisted with for decades without anyone much noticing or caring that they're not meeting their objectives. One such area is to do with technology and innovation. Dominic Cummings, very big on the need for governments to improve on the development of science and technology. If you're interested in what works on that front, then you look for examples from recent history where it has previously done so. And the model that he pointed to of how this could be done best was in America in the form of ARPA, the Advanced Research Projects Agency, or as it was later renamed, DARPA, when defence was added to the front of it. The pre-runner of ARPA helped the Allies to win the Second World War. It did so by getting around a particular problem. The military generally fought in a very linear way. They didn't support apparently wacky ideas. They couldn't imagine different types of weapons or tools to those that they already had at hand. They just wanted better versions of what they'd already got. Luckily, there were visionary people who did get the difference. And for instance, their work resulted in sonar and radar that, amongst other things, ended the massacre of Allied ships by German U-boats by making those U-boats visible. So that was the early version. Then we ended up in the Cold War. And when the Soviets shocked America by launching Sputnik, the new Defence Secretary, Neil McElroy, decided that the country needed to move fast on developing defence and other technology. He was a former marketer and he knew from experience how much large organisations resist radical ideas. So he created the new agency, ARPA, looking back to that earlier example, that would fund far-out research ideas. You probably know it went on to create ARPANET, the early computer network that was designed to keep communications flowing even if individual nodes were taken out by the enemy. It would smartly reroute traffic through its remaining nodes. We now know that network as the internet and use it to send pictures of kittens. ARPA created the GPS technology that's in your smartphone. It created the first voice-operated computer. It created seismic sensors capable of distinguishing earthquakes from nuclear tests, which made the first nuclear test ban treaty possible. The military, by the way, had said that such a thing wasn't possible, couldn't possibly be done. They dismissed the DARPA team working on seismology as, quote, a bunch of incompetents. Not only did they enable the test ban treaty, but a project offshoot validated the theory of plate tectonics, thereby permanently changing the field of geology. So how did that happen? What was different about how ARPA was organised that helped it to be so creative and fruitful that Dominic Cummings thought could be copied? First of all, it was independent and protected from the standard bureaucracy, in this case the military. Traditional structures have their incentives shaped around what it takes to progress up the career ladder. And rarely does such a structure reward free thinking and risk-taking. DARPA was run like a loose collection of small startups, 100 or so autonomous units given a huge amount of freedom and support. But they were nevertheless required to collaborate closely with the Defence Department and its overall objectives, because they were there to look at their problems and to think creatively about how those problems could be solved in ways that, in this case the military, would never think of themselves. ARPA had visions rather than specific goals. It funded brilliant people, not specific projects. And it could therefore end up funding different and sometimes opposing projects, not knowing which one would win out to be the best. All of that's an interesting case study in how you get things done. Cummings was focused on that question and was completely dismissive of most career politicians and most civil service bureaucrats as people who were incapable of high performance, that they were just servicing structures that were bloated. He noted that there'd been an attempt to copy ARPA in the UK in 2014, which was blocked by the Cabinet Office, which justified its resistance by saying that DARPA had had a lot of failures. Anyone who deals with highly innovative businesses would know that was a ridiculous criticism. Innovation processes are always going to generate large numbers of failures. Thomas Edison famously failed over 100 times to invent the light bulb before he found the route that did. We'd all still be in the dark if the 2014 Cabinet Office had been funding him. So all of that just fed Cummings' contempt for the machine. He said this: "I think it's possible to create something new that could scale very fast and enable us to do politics and government extremely differently, as different to today as the internet and PC were to the post-war mainframes." But he admitted that there would be lots of resistance. The good news is that we have discovered a lot about high-performance teams, HPTs, stretching back thousands of years of recorded history and literature. The bad news is that our evolved nature makes it very hard to accept and apply these lessons, and our political institutions are constructed in such a way as to make it practically impossible, and mostly illegal, for them to reach high performance. Even more difficult, HPTs are inherently dangerous, and in many areas we must be wary of giving them centralised power. And right there was an acknowledgement of a contradiction which I think more than anything else actually brought him down. Setting up an agency to work on technological innovation is one thing. Using similar principles to reinvent government was a different project altogether. Yes, government should aim to be competent and effective. Incompetence is obviously never helpful, but that's not their main purpose. Their main purpose is to be deliberative and responsive. They have to have democratic legitimacy, the mandate from the population. That's the whole point of them. And why you sometimes have to put up with the frustrations of slower movement and all of those elected backbench parliamentarians. Cummings knew how to make campaigns work. He knew how to make innovation work. He did not know how to make government work. If you're running a one-off campaign, aggression is an effective tactic. It won't win you friends, but it gets results, and that's what you're aiming for. If you're running a disruptive populist campaign, maybe a tight-knit band of dedicated campaigners enables you to be more nimble than the big, ponderous and focused opposition. But that small group won't be enough to run the ship once you've won power. Also, the campaign is focusing on winning at the expense of the other side. That's not how the process of government works. You have to resolve the needs of different legitimate interests. In the ongoing process of politics, you have to build broad alliances, because there's no way to effectively govern if you don't take people with you. Even businesses who don't have to worry about democratic legitimacy and are the organisations that have the best track record of being effective in a way that Cummings wants to see, they understand that you can't just be task focused to the exclusion of all else. Standard leadership training would tell you that you should be able to split your focus between the individual, the team and the task. Build up and develop each individual in the team. Make them feel valued and able to perform to the best of their ability. Ensure then that the team works well together, balancing people's strengths and weaknesses, setting a collaborative culture. And then you're able to become high performance in getting the tasks done. Yes, people who want to get stuff done but ultimately fail are almost always just focusing on the task part of that to the exclusion of all else. And they don't want to delegate to anyone who they think is less capable of themselves, so they try and do it all, they become a bottleneck and so on and so on. And you can see that in everything about how Dominic Cummings is said to have worked, plus the advice he gave. On his blog, he said this: "My advice to those trying to get things done in Westminster is focus, know yourself, face errors, think operationally, work harder than others, don't stick to the rules, and ask yourself to be or to do." And all of that is task, task, task. Want to get more done? Push yourself harder. So what did this look like in practice? He famously introduced what was described as a NASA-style control room. It brought people from different departments together and had key performance indicators such as COVID cases shown at the front in a big screen. This move was greeted with some derision by the media, by the way, but it mimicked what many businesses aim to do: identify what are the important measures of proper success and make the progress or lack of progress towards those goals highly visible. It's a powerful motivational device when used appropriately to keep you focused on the big goals. Whether that's directly translatable into the political dimension is unproven. Certainly the events of the final week before he left, with all the internal politics and the infighting, showed that attention had strayed somewhat from the big goals. But the main point is that he was powerful, and he was tolerated by many who disliked him because he had a strong vision for how the country could be run better. People who have a plan, with a strong intellectual foundation and with a passionate drive to make it happen, those people are immensely attractive to others who want to make a difference but don't have a plan of their own. The irony is that this drive also made Dominic Cummings exactly what he had been campaigning against so effectively. Maybe it was the pandemic that did this, but ultimately the anti-elitist became the elite, championing data in order to manipulate the masses, using simple slogans to get compliance, dismissing and disregarding all those whose intellect didn't match his own high standards, and then ultimately failing because he became out of touch. Because the outsider's view of tearing down systems is not the same mindset and process for building systems that work in the long term. The effective leaders of a business create a strategy around their organisation's strengths. Dominic Cummings' chosen organisation, the Conservative Party, is founded on respect and support for institutions. Well, Dominic Cummings never met an institution that he didn't want to tear down. So look, in conclusion, the gossip and the headlines are not giving the real story. A lot of the ideas Dominic Cummings brought to government deserves to outlast his time there. But because he didn't apply the question, what works, in a more rounded way to the different facets of a process of driving change through a parliamentary system, he was never going to succeed. I mean, you can focus on the detail of the squabbles that happened at the end, but basically this was always going to end the way that it did. Only those details were going to differ depending on exactly how it played out. And look, creating change is hard. Governing is hard. Thomas Edison got more than 100 chances to invent his light bulb. In politics, you get many fewer chances to fail before you get it right, quite often just for once. No doubt, Cummings will be back blogging once the bruises have healed anyway. And the media, of course, can't wait because they want to see what dirt he's going to dish on Boris Johnson in revenge. Personally, I think we should be more interested in what he has to share about what was learned, about what worked and what didn't in trying to improve the process of government. Maybe once the dust has settled, we can get that. And it will be more insightful than just how incompetent some of his colleagues turn out to be, which after all, probably isn't going to be news.